Okay, so we've talked about what a polyculture is and how you can have an annual polyculture or a perennial polyculture, or the ultimate example of a polyculture being the forest garden. So let's have a look at what annual polyculture might actually look like. Okay, so Patrick gave you the example of growing sweet corn in combination with pumpkins, because the sweet corn is tall and thin and doesn't cast much shade, and the pumpkin is low and bushy. It's important to grow sweet corn at quite a large distance apart because it's wind pollinated. You tend to plant it in blocks of about 18 inches apart, so that the flowers can be pollinated by the wind. And that means that in an ordinary situation there's an awful lot of bare soil that's not being made use of. So in a similar vein, a polyculture that I often plant at home is around my purple sprouting broccoli, and that was another example that Patrick used because it is a plant that takes a long time to grow and eventually will fill quite a lot of space. So it's planted quite far apart and there's potentially a lot of bare soil in between the plants that in the meantime is not being made use of. So you've got your purple sprouting broccoli plants like this, and they take about 8 weeks to reach somewhere like their final size, their final space that they're using up. So you've got quite a long time to make use of that soil around them. A plant that can be grown in between them very easily is lettuce. Lettuce takes around 6 weeks to be harvestable. It's also a plant that can tolerate, especially in the summer, a certain level of shade and sometimes benefits from it. So you can plant your lettuces around the base of your purple sprouting broccoli like this. You've still got quite a bit of bare soil because obviously the lettuces take 6 weeks to reach their full size. And so what could you use to make use of that space in between the lettuces? Something that doesn't take up much space and is very quick to be harvestable. Any thoughts? Radishes, perfect. So in between there you've got all your little radishes growing, and they take about 3 weeks in the middle of the summer to get going. And so that's a very simple 3-plant polyculture. And as Patrick said, the more plants you introduce into a polyculture, the less of a huge increase in yield you get from that space. So when you have 2 plants together, like the sweet corn and the pumpkins, you can get about 150% of your yield from the space available. Every time you add in another type of plant, that reduces slightly, but still you're getting more than 100% of the yield that you would get if you were only growing 1 plant. So it's very beneficial in those terms. And also, while you've got all of these other plants filling this space, what you don't have is so many weeds. What you don't have is so much water evaporation from the soil. And what you do have is a soil that's being less disturbed by constant hoeing and weeding. So, any questions about that principle as an annual polyculture? No.
So there you have quite different types of plants. One is root type of plant, the other one is like leaf kind of plant, and the other one is like more high type of plant. Does that also include like exchanges in potassium, something like that? There needs the nutrients.
Yeah, good point. So what you need to think about is if you're getting a higher yield out of a space, then you need to put in a little bit more in terms of fertility. So you know, we already have unnaturally high levels of fertility in the soil that we cultivate because we're trying to get a lot of cropping out of them. And so the soil that we have in our gardens is a lot more fertile than most natural soil is. So again, if you're hoping to get 150% or 130% yield from that space, you do need to put in more fertility in terms of more composting or plant feeds and that kind of thing. And so what you need to look at is the needs of each of your plants and make sure that that they've got what they need to provide them with that. And if you've got two, I mean, it's interesting because the sweet corn and the pumpkin are both very sort of high nitrogen feeding plants. So they're both quite, they're both in the group of plants that I tend to call greedies. They're heavy feeding plants. They're also very productive plants. So if you're growing sweet corn and pumpkin together, you do need to pump in a lot more compost, and think about high nitrogen things like manure, nettle feed, that kind of thing. Things that you can add to help to get that abundance of yield out of the space.
Because you've got also plants that brings nitrogen to the earth, right?
Yes, there are nitrogen fixing plants.
That.
Yeah, but the trouble with trying to introduce nitrogen fixing plants into an annual system is that if you're growing an annual crop of something like a bean or a pea, a leguminous plant, which does fix nitrogen into the soil, that plant will be mostly using that nitrogen while it's growing. And so nitrogen fixes tend to be more useful in perennial systems. And it also takes time for the exchange of nitrogen being fixed into the soil by those plants to make its way then throughout the soil to other plants. But it does have a build-up effect over time as you're growing nitrogen fixers, but they do tend to be more relevant in perennial systems.
Or for crop rotation, right? You plant a legume before you plant broccoli.
Yeah, and often people will, instead of pulling the roots of the beans out, people will often leave the roots in the soil so that there's time for those for that nitrogen to be spread out for other plants to use. Yeah. Okay.
Because if you're going to put compost, if you're going to compost the earth and you're not digging,
Yeah.
do you just lie it on top, or do you only use it as a liquid fertiliser? Or
No. So we do tend to, that's another reason that people use for digging the soil, is to incorporate compost
so
and
how do you do it
manure
if you're
and
not
things like
digging?
that. You place it on the surface.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
And it does
So-
the same?
Yeah, so if you put compost on the surface of the soil, the earthworms in particular will drag that organic matter down into the soil to eat it. So that's their natural habits, they pull it down. And if you're putting things like manure on, you have to be a bit careful. It's always better to use well-rotted manure if you're putting it directly onto the soil, partly because sometimes fresh manure it's way too rich and it can scorch the roots of plants because it's too rich, but also it has a tendency to dry out in lumps and then it doesn't get incorporated very well. So semi-rotted manure can be used in some situations, especially in something like a 3-layer mulch, which I'm going to tell you about later in the course, because that's usually covered, the manure layer is covered so it doesn't have the opportunity to dry out. But generally using well-rotted manure is much better for vegetable beds. And again, you can put it on the surface and it will be cooled down.
If you're just putting your compost on the surface and waiting for the worms to draw down the nutrients, does that take longer than if you dug it in?
Well, not necessarily. No, because partly any soluble nutrients will be leached down into the soil by the action of the rain. But also, because you're mimicking natural processes, that's how the microbes in the soil process that matter. It's usually, it falls on the surface and the worms pull it down and then other creatures use it. And so I don't think it takes any longer to do it that way than incorporating it into the soil. It may be just, it feels like it's quicker digging it in. But it still has to, the microbes still have to go through all of their processes. Yeah.
But when you plant something like a seedling or a bigger plant, you dig a hole, right, and you put some compost in.
Yeah, so when we say no dig, we don't mean thou shalt never ever put a tool into the soil. So if you're growing potatoes or something, you know, if you're growing a root crop, whatever, of course you have to disturb the soil, of course you have to put a spade into it and etc. So what we mean by no dig, it really should be no till. Because what we mean is you're not routinely cultivating the soil. But we will cover the whole theory behind that in the soil session in more detail. So this is really about how we can apply the principles of original permaculture to our day-to-day gardening and growing. And so the main things that we advocate are introducing diversity of plants in the form of polycultures, introducing diversity of wildlife in the form of growing polycultures and attracting plants, having healthy soil, so not digging the soil, and the use of mulches.
But mulch isn't like always beneficial in a temperate climate, considering slugs and pests.
Yeah, so there are lots of different kinds of mulches, and you have to, like anything, this is not dogma, you need to figure out what is appropriate. So, for example, yes, mulches can attract slugs. They can harbour slugs, they make a good environment for them. And what we found, similarly to what Charles Dowding does in his no-dig garden, we only mulch with compost. And so we use compost as a mulch. And slugs generally don't like crawling over open spaces much if they can help it. And so we're not creating a better environment for the slugs to live in by doing that.